10 Typewriter Tales, a collection of stories, written by Thomas Fincham, narrated by John William Cantiz. The Assignment. The professor spoke animatedly as he described what he wanted from his students. They were to write a one-page article on an issue that was intriguing or unique. He wanted to see something that he had never seen before. "Surprise me," he said. "A good journalist is someone who can find something that can shock and surprise the reader." Professor Harry Stolter loved to give his first-year journalist students this assignment. It was a very difficult assignment, and he knew it. He also gave them only 1 week to research and prepare for it. 1 week to submit an assignment worth so much could be called unfair. Perhaps if he gave them more time, they could do a better job, but no, Professor Stolter would have none of that. He regarded this assignment as his weapon of truth. This assignment would weed out the ones who belonged from the ones who did not. Better they find out now if they were cut out to be journalists than later, when they were out of school. It was his gift to his students. Jimmy and Mike came out of the university building and walked down a narrow path. They were both Professor Stolter's students and were talking about the assignment. Mike held his backpack while Jimmy had his swung over his shoulder. "So, what are you going to write about?" Mike asked. "I don't know," Jimmy replied with his head down. "I can't believe this assignment is worth 50% of our final marks. How does he expect us to do it in 1 week?" Mike said. "I don't know," Jimmy replied again. Everybody had said Professor Stolter was the hardest. He can't humanly expect us to research, interview, and write an article of this importance in 1 week. Not possible. "He thinks it is." "No, he doesn't," Mike said. "He knows half of us won't be able to write something worth that much. Even if we were, it will be a piece of crap." "We have no choice," Jimmy said. They stopped on the side of the street. Mike said, "When the professor spoke of the assignment, I started thinking, and I think I may have a story." Jimmy raised his head. "You do?" "I have a great-uncle who lives in Oshawa. He fought in World War II. "He did?" "Not sure exactly when and where he fought during the war." Mike scratched his head. "But every Thanksgiving he talks about it. He shows us his war photos and his medals, but I never really bothered paying any attention. No one did." "I think he'll be glad to tell his story to someone who's willing to listen." "So you're going to Oshawa?" "Have to. Can't ask him to come down here. He's 81. "That's for sure." "What about you?" Mike asked. "No idea. You wouldn't happen to have more great-uncles who fought in world wars?" "Sorry, just one." "Then I'm dead." "Don't worry. Something will come up." Mike looked at his watch. "Well, I have to go. Don't want to miss my history class. Keep in touch. Email me when you find something." Jimmy nodded as he watched his friend run into the distance. He lowered his head and tried hard to think of something or someone. Did he have any relatives with distinguished backgrounds? None he could think of. He hardly knew any of his relatives. He didn't really know his past, for that matter. Not being able to think of something to write about made him angry and frustrated. He wanted to be a journalist ever since he read about the Watergate scandal. That lit a fire in him. He dreamed of traveling the world and capturing important issues. But those dreams were now slipping away. If he didn't have an interesting story by next week, he'd definitely fail that class. He began to walk in the other direction when he heard a voice. "Hey, son." He turned and saw a man walking towards him. The man had a long beard, unclean baggy clothes, and a dirty green bag swung over his shoulders. Jimmy quickly concluded the man was homeless. "I couldn't help overhearing that you needed a story," the man said with a devilish smile. Jimmy was unsure what to say. "You need a story for your journalism class, right?" Jimmy nodded. With his arms stretched out and a wide smile on his face, the man said, "You're a journalist, and I'm your story." Jimmy shook his head. "I'm not sure." "Why not? What could be more interesting than a story on a homeless guy?" "I don't think so." "Come on, son. Why wouldn't you want to know the life story of an old man? How he ended up like this? How he survives on the street? I wasn't homeless and destitute when I was born, you know." Jimmy was still unsure. The man looked in the direction Mike had gone. I haven't fought in any wars, but I still have a hell of a great story to tell. Sorry, Jimmy said as he began walking in the other direction. You got $1? Jimmy heard the man ask from behind. What? Jimmy turned. $1. I'm homeless, I still need to feed myself. Jimmy pulled out a coin and gave it to the man. God bless you, son. If you still want a story, I do business at the corner of Queen and Coxwell. Later that day, the man sat in the corner of a busy street holding a cup. Spare some change? He said, but most of the pedestrians ignored and walked past him. Undeterred, he politely said the same 3 words to each passerby, hoping one would listen and give something. One did. A woman. She dropped a few coins in his cup. God bless you, he said, as she scurried away, uninterested in his response. He dropped the coins in his left palm while holding the cup with his right. He counted the coins and concluded there were 63 cents. He shook his head. Then he heard a single coin drop. He looked up and smiled, and then looked inside the cup. $1. I guess you changed your mind. Jimmy removed his backpack and sat beside him. War veterans are hard to find these days, Jimmy said. Jimmy T. Banks, he said, extending his hand. Sammy, the man said as they shook hands. No last name? No last name, son, Sammy said. We homeless people prefer to hide our true identities. We don't want the whole world to know who we really are. Then I guess Sammy it is. What does the T stand for? Sammy asked. What? Jimmy T. Banks. Tim's. It used to be my birth parents' names. You're adopted? Sammy said, looking out onto the street. Yeah. Jimmy removed a pad and a pen from his backpack. A passerby dropped coins into Sammy's cup. This time, Sammy did not count them. Instead, he dropped them into his coat pocket. Jimmy flipped the pad and, on a clean sheet, wrote the name Sammy with quotation marks. Next to the name, he wrote the date, time, and location of the interview. What do you call what you do? Jimmy asked. You mean beg? Sammy replied. I didn't exactly mean it that way. It's begging, son. Don't feel bad. That's what it's called. Unless, Sammy scratched his head. You may call it panhandling. That's politically correct, I guess. Panhandling is just fine. How much do you take home? Make in a day? Depends. On a good day, maybe $20. How much on a bad day? Maybe half that, Sammy said. He leaned closer. The key to this profession is location, location, location. If you're in the right spot, and more people pass you by, you eventually receive more. Simple, isn't it? I didn't think it worked that way. Neither did I, until I found even panhandling was like a job. So tell me, how long have you been on the streets? Jimmy asked. 3 years, about. How did you end up on the streets? Ah, the juice of your story, right? Sorry? We're getting to the main points of your story. Yes, Jimmy paused, but then spoke again. You do have a hell of a story to tell me, right? Son, I will not disappoint. I was married twice. In my second marriage, I had everything. I had a wife, 2 kids, a great job, an expensive car, a big house. You name it, I had it. Then what happened? Jimmy asked. I left everything, Sammy replied in a matter-of-fact tone. Left everything? I don't understand. I couldn't take it anymore. I wasn't a good father or a good husband. For many years, I thought I was. I thought I was doing everything right. I worked hard, provided the best for my family, but in the end, it was worthless. Sammy looked at Jimmy. You're not making notes. Jimmy instantly began scribbling on the pad. How? Jimmy asked, looking up. How at the end, it was worthless? Jimmy nodded. Let me start from the beginning, Sammy said. I graduated from Queen's University with honors, started working as a teller in a bank, and from there I went on to become a bank manager. I was in charge of a bank on Bay Street. Life was good, I suppose. Sometimes I had to work 14 hours a day, even 70 hours a week. But I didn't mind. As long as I was providing the best for my family. I owned a large house up on Thornhill. I drove a BMW. My wife drove a Lexus, both the latest models. My kids had everything. They had their own playground built on our large property. We had a swimming pool. We even had a tennis court. Can you imagine the area of our property? I was even ready to buy my daughter, she's the oldest, a pony. I gave my family everything, but at that time I didn't realize it was all going to be worthless. There was silence as someone dropped coins into the cup. God bless you, Sammy said. But how did you end up like this? Jimmy said. Ah, son, you know the key to a good story, Sammy said, leaning over. You make the reader stay until the end. I'm not going to get my whole interview today, am I? Jimmy asked. Nope. I want you to come back here tomorrow. Same time, same place. Not the same time, Jimmy said, packing his stuff. I have a lecture. Then afterward. Okay, see you tomorrow. With that, Jimmy was off. The next day, Sammy sat on a bench a few feet from where he conducted his business. He was reading an old, worn-out book. Not working today? He heard Jimmy ask. He looked up and said, Have you read the novel Fifth Business by Robertson Davies? Jimmy sat beside him. Yes, in high school. One of my favorites. I've read it a half a dozen times, Sammy said, inhaling the fresh air. I never get bored of it. You like books? Jimmy asked. Why do you ask? I have many piled up in my basement. I could give you some if you like. Sammy stretched his arms and looked at Jimmy. That won't be necessary, he said. I get my supplies from the libraries. You have a library card? No, of course not. With no fixed address, they don't give library cards to people like me. To make space for new books, libraries place the old and discarded ones outside their doors. During the night, I go over and pick whichever I'm in the mood for. Wow, I didn't know that, Jimmy said. You hungry? Sammy asked. Not really. In my profession, every day is a payday. My treat. Sammy got up and began walking east. There's a great coffee shop along Queen Street that doesn't mind my type of people. Inside the coffee shop, they sat in the far corner facing the windows. Sammy ordered 2 coffees and 1 donut, and 1 muffin. Jimmy removed his pen and pad and began preparing for the interview. Sammy sat opposite of him, staring at his every movement. Let me see, Jimmy said, scanning his notes. We were at how you ended up on the streets. Jimmy looked up to see Sammy still staring at him. Something wrong? Jimmy asked with a laugh. No, nothing, Sammy replied with a smile. Okay, Jimmy said. So, how did you end up on the streets? Sammy did not answer the question, but instead asked a question of his own. James, how was your day? It's Jimmy, Jimmy quickly replied. Sammy leaned closer. Jimmy doesn't do you justice. Jimmy sounds like a name I would use. Sammy, Jimmy, sounds the same. Wouldn't James T. Banks sound better? It would, but allow an old man one request. Let me call you James. It sounds so much better. Jimmy laughed at the unusual request. He agreed only if it would speed up the interview. All right, but then let me call you Samuel, if that's your real name. It's a deal. So how was your day, James? Samuel asked again. I thought we were going to talk about you. I've been on the streets for 3 years now. It's not every day that I get to meet a bright young man like you. So, how was your day, James? Good, I guess, James replied, not knowing what else to say. What did you do today? Where'd you go? Who are your friends? Anyone special? He said, his tone teasing when he posed the last question. James, blushing a little, said, No one special. I'm in my first year, and I don't really want any distractions. Good. Focus on your studies. That's the way to go. You'll have the rest of your life for that stuff. I have a friend. His name is Mike. The fellow who has a great uncle? Samuel interrupted. Yes, that one. And I didn't really go anywhere today, except to my lectures. Samuel slowly took a sip of coffee. Then he asked, How are your folks? They're pretty cool. I mean, how is your old man? He's cool. You get along well? Yeah, really well. He's always been there for me, considering I was adopted. Samuel took another slow sip. What does he do? He works for a car manufacturer. He puts wheels on the cars. Sounds like a tough job. It is. It was. He got laid off. Sorry to hear that, Samuel said. It's okay. He got a decent layoff package. What about your mom? She's a substitute teacher, James said. She used to work once or twice a week, but now that Dad's laid off, she'll be substituting more. But she doesn't mind. Sounds like you have great parents, Sammy said. They are great, James said, beaming. He then leaned over and whispered, You want to hear something funny? When I got into university, my mom bought me a cell phone, so she could always keep in touch. I keep it turned off. It's not cool to have your mom call you every 5 minutes. They laughed. Dad always sits and watches sports with me, even though I know he doesn't like sports. You're lucky to have parents like that, Samuel said. I know. James took a sip of his coffee. You don't like your donut? Samuel asked after a pause. I can get you another. No, this is fine. James took a bite. What sports do you like? Samuel asked. Basketball. Michael Jordan was my hero growing up, but now it's Toronto Raptors. Really? Samuel said. I love basketball too. I had season tickets to all the Raptors games. Season tickets? Wow, that must rock, James replied excitedly. Front row, son. I could smell the players' sweat. It must have been great. It was okay, Samuel said, turning to the window. My boy never went with me. He's into music and alternative rock, something I can never understand. What happened to the tickets? Don't know. One day I left everything, including the season tickets. Now, do you want to tell me how you ended up like this? Heart attack, Samuel replied calmly. Heart attack? One day I had a heart attack, so I left. I don't understand. Son, the life I had made was no life at all. It was a life full of material gains and stress. The sole purpose of my making money was to acquire goods, buy a new car, have the best furniture, take a trip to the Caribbean. There was no pleasure in it. All I did was keep up with the Joneses, and I got tired of running. Running? James inquired. Yes, running here, running there, always running. Running for a meeting, running to take clients out to lunch, running to meet deadlines. First, it was my pager beeping. Then it was my cell phone. Now it's my emails. No end in sight. I just got tired of it all. James was silent, but then said, But that can't be all. Samuel said, You see, son, I had spent most of my life trying to build a life that was fruitless. I spent so much time at work that I missed seeing my kids grow up. My wife and I grew apart. It was like coming home to a stranger, sometimes not saying a word to her for days. I was so apart from my children that all I was to them was someone who bought things. Whatever my kids wanted, I gave it to them. But all they really wanted was to be with me. Eventually, they hardly noticed whenever I was home because they were so used to me being away. Don't they say money is the root of all evil? James said. At the time, I didn't view it that way. Growing up, I didn't have much money, and it caused me to make certain regrettable decisions. I gave my family money instead of me. James said, So one day you walked out of that life. Yes, after the heart attack, Samuel said, finishing his coffee. How did you have that heart attack? Samuel closed his eyes and then reopened them. That day, I remember it quite vividly, I was in my office at the bank when I felt a sharp pain in my chest. My arms began to feel numb. I collapsed on the floor and fell unconscious. Next thing I knew, I was in the hospital, but the one thing I remembered most from that day, I can never forget, when I came around, the look on my family's face was distant, as if they were there to meet a stranger. When they saw I was awake, they hugged me, but like them, I felt nothing. It was then that I knew I was living a dead man's life. I'm sorry, James said. Don't be. I'm not. I don't blame my family. Maybe if I had made different decisions, my life could have been better, but I guess I'll never know. You can still go back. Maybe, he shrugged. But who would want to? Suddenly his face lit up, and a smile crossed his face. Now I live carefree. I eat what I want. I go where I please. Did you know, in the 18 years of my marriage, I did not read a single book? Not a single book. Now I lie under the shade of a tree and read all day. No one bothers me." "You make it sound like your life is great now," James said. "It's not. No, wait. For me, it is. But for so many homeless people, it is not. They live their lives not knowing whether tomorrow they will still be alive. Some live for the day, beg, and spend it. Others live with the hope that tomorrow something good will happen. Maybe they might win the lottery, or maybe someone will give them a chance for a better life. You see, I made a decision to be homeless, but so many did not. They would do anything to have the life that you had, maybe even for a day," James said. "Yes, I know." Silently, they both stared out the window. "Well, son," Samuel said, breaking the silence, "it was a pleasure talking with you. I've done what I wanted." "Done?" James said. "Our interview. You have my story. Now, we're done." Samuel began to leave the coffee shop. James followed behind. "I still have a few more questions to ask," James said. "No more. Not today anyway. It's getting dark," Samuel said. "I need my sleep." "Where will you sleep? Is there anything?" "No, son. I'll be fine. I've been doing this for 3 years now." His face brightened up. "Plus, there's a bench in a park on Coxwell Avenue. Long bench." He extended his arms. "Wide, too. Just perfect for a guy like me." Samuel waved goodbye and left. The next morning, Samuel woke up to find the sun beating on his eyes. He tried covering them, but the sun came down in full force. He decided to get up, and just as he did, he saw James standing near, with a wide smile and something in his hands. Samuel grunted. "Son, I'm beginning to wonder. First I see you outside your school, then I see you where I work, now I see you where I sleep. I'm beginning to doubt if you're not a stalker." "If I was a stalker," James said, "you'd be dead by now." "True." James sat beside him. "My mom made an egg sandwich. I thought you might like it." James unrolled the bag with the sandwich and handed it to Samuel. "I haven't had a home-cooked meal in a long time," Samuel said, taking a bite. "I also brought orange juice if you like." "How did you know I would be here?" James beamed back. "There aren't a lot of park benches on Coxwell, just perfect to sleep on." Samuel nodded. "Plus," James said, "I still have some more questions." "Ah, you do. But I have no more answers. I told you everything I could. After I left the coffee shop, there were so many questions running in my mind. Trivial questions, so I thought against coming today. But while I was lying in bed, it occurred to me that there's still one question I would like to ask you." "And what is that?" "On our first meeting, you mentioned you were married twice. What happened to your first marriage?" James asked. After a brief pause, Samuel said, "It just wasn't meant to be." "Divorce?" "No," Samuel shot back, but then he instantly became calm. "Nothing like that." "Then what?" Samuel stayed quiet. James spoke. "If it makes you uncomfortable, I'll understand." "We were young," Samuel said. "I was in my 3rd year of university. She was in her 2nd. We got married while still in school. We even had a child. We didn't have any money, but we had each other, and life seemed perfect, but one night it all suddenly ended." Samuel finished the sandwich and then continued. "We were driving back from a school party when a van hit the passenger side head-on. She died instantly from head injuries. The driver of the van was a student in one of my classes. He was also returning from the same party, but unfortunately he had too much to drink. After that, I moved away, far away, and started a new life. I got a job at a bank, and I also met a wonderful woman. The rest, you know." For a few seconds, everything was quiet, and nothing stirred. Then a gust of wind brushed the trees, rustling the leaves. James looked at his watch. "It's almost noon." "I better get back to work," Samuel said, as if punctuality was crucial in his profession. "Before I forget," James said, removing a small portable radio from his pocket. "My dad bought this years ago. No one uses it now, so I thought maybe you might like it." "Thank you," Samuel said in disbelief. "I put new batteries in it. And I've set it to Raptors radio. Plus, he pulled out a folded newspaper. The entire Raptors schedule is on here, so you'll know when to listen in. Thank you again, son. The least I could do, James said. You practically saved my career. Without you, I wouldn't have a story. Samuel smiled at the gift. I better start packing, he said. He quickly folded his blanket and placed it in the green bag. Having finished cleaning up, he looked James in the eye. It was good to have spent some time with you. You're a good kid. You're going to make your parents very proud. I wish you all the happiness in the world. I truly do. And thanks for listening to an old man. James just nodded. Thanks for the radio, Samuel said, waving it in the air. I might just pawn it. You do that if you have to, James said with a smile. A few days later, James returned to the park. He had already been to the spot where Samuel frequently worked. Unable to find him there, he decided to go to the park. He was unprepared for what awaited him. A strand of yellow police tape surrounded the park bench where Samuel slept. A police officer stood to one side. Seeing James approach, the officer said, "You can't be here." "What happened here?" James asked, a little dazed. "Sorry, go back. This area is sealed off," the officer replied. "Please just tell me what happened here," James pleaded. "Last night, a homeless man died of a heart attack. They've just taken his body." James felt as if he was losing his breath. "I know that homeless man. His name is Sammy," James said. "Then you better go down to the station." James hurried to the police station. "You're a relative?" a female officer asked. "No, a friend. Your name?" "James Banks. Jimmy Banks." "Jimmy T. Banks?" "Yes." "Then I have something for you," she said. She took him to a room and placed a green bag in front of him. James recognized Samuel's duffel bag. The officer pulled out everything. James could see a blanket, various other articles of clothing, and a brown metal box. The officer handed the box to James. James opened the box. He saw a photo of a family sitting together. Samuel sat wearing a nice suit with a woman and 2 children. James also found a folded piece of paper. He looked at the piece of paper. It had James's name, his address, his phone number, where he went to school, everything. A summary of his life's history was written by hand on that paper. James suddenly began to feel lightheaded. He picked up a key that belonged to a safety deposit box. Then his eyes caught something. It was another photo. In it, Samuel was very young. He was standing beside a young woman who was holding a baby. James flipped the photo and read what was written on the back with a blue pen. October 17th, 1981. That was his date of birth. James looked at the key again, and it had a name, Samuel Timms, on it. James' hands began to tremble as he unlocked the box. At the bottom of the box was a yellow rectangular paper. When he picked it up, he found it was a birth certificate. It read, James Timms, born October 17th, 1981, Toronto, Ontario, Canada. Parents, Samuel E. Timms and Caroline F. Timms. James turned to the officer and then fell to the floor in a faint. He had his history and now so much more. This has been 10 Typewriter Tales, a collection of stories, written by Thomas Fincham, narrated by John William Cantees, copyright 2021 by Thomas Fincham, production copyright by Thomas Fincham.